Aquí, huesi wapani, huesi lasimamo, Patawi biwesi pilawe atawakila, Nyawe. I first recognize that I don't belong on this land. This belongs to someone else, and I do ask permission to speak, for I respect that I am a visitor. Yahweh. My name is Paulette Blanchard. My Shawnee name is Patawi Biwesi, which means gold feather of an eagle. I am bird clan. And I graduated from Haskell Indian Nations University in Lawrence, Kansas, which was a boarding school. It's one of the longest still running tribal colleges. It was a forced boarding school. I started this project at Haskell as an undergraduate, and I had a summer project through the Haskell Environmental Research Studies Institute. And the objective was to look at climate change from your own perspective as a Native person, and possibly look at how climate change might be impacting your people. So I chose to go back to Oklahoma and see how climate change is impacting tribes in Oklahoma. I could not find a journal article, book, reference to tribes and climate change or weather, including the Dust Bowl. That bothered me. Not only were we silenced, but we were literally erased, and that upset me, because I had stories from my grandmother of what they experienced during those hard times. I was sitting with a relative during bread dance ceremony. We have a spring bread dance and a fall bread dance. The spring bread dance opens up our planting season. It transitions from the men's season of hunting to the women's season of planting. And I was sitting with an auntie, and it was already 110 degrees and quite dusty and hot. And sandburst stickers went through the moccasins, and it was really kind of uncomfortable for early May. And my auntie looked up and said, if we're going to have bread dance this year, our squirrels are going to have elephant ears. And I thought that was a really odd way to look at that. And I asked her what she meant. And she said, for many generations, our ceremony follows the bloom of a certain tree. When the leaves are the size of the squirrels here, we call ceremony, and we know that we can plant. She goes, for many generations, it's happened around the first or second week of May. She goes, and now more consistently, it's happening around the second or third week of April. And it's caused conflict between the contemporary tribal members and the traditionalists. So that to me was a very powerful statement, and it made me reflect more closely on what was happening. And so when I came to the University of Oklahoma, or as an undergraduate at Haskell, I put on the first ever Oklahoma Intertribal Meeting on Climate Variability and Change. And out of 39 tribes in Oklahoma, 22 came together and talked about climate change. And it was a listening session for the scientists. And that was not only the first time that the tribes had talked about climate in that region, but that was the first time the scientists were hearing. So from that, one of the things that came out of that first meeting was that tribes wanted more local relevant information about what was happening. They wanted access to the tools so they could make their own decisions, and they wanted to be heard. So we put together actually the original one was 6 workshops across 2 states, inviting 63 tribes in the region. We ended up doing 5. Instead of doing 2 in New Mexico, we did 1, and we did 4 in Oklahoma in the 4 different corners. And out of the 63 tribes, 33 participated. One of the things that was a challenge was there was multiple landscapes, multiple ecoregions, climate zones, elevations, temperatures, and precipitation differences, just in Oklahoma. And so it became, for me, it was important to show the scientists that a one-size-fits-all policy was not going to be appropriate, and especially when you have 33 or 63 different nations' opinions and decisions and experiences and home-based lands, some being relocated to regions, others never left. So I put together my research question, which was, I had 4 questions. My objective was to show, since there was no information about how tribes were experiencing climate change, or if they were identifying it, I first had to prove that tribes knew what climate change was, and then how they were identifying it. So I had 4 questions. What does climate change mean to you? What environmental transformations are happening in your place that you attribute to climate change? Are you and your tribe or your tribe discussing climate change? And what are you doing about it? That led into quite an interesting discussion. The first question, what does climate change mean to you, was one of the richest questions that people responded to. A lot of the responses had to do with what was happening, experiential, observational happenings. It wasn't a noun. Climate change was not separate. It was a very interactive, imposing, experiential thing that was happening, and every single person I interviewed recognized not only what climate change was, but identified that it was happening. These are some of the quotes from some of the participants at the workshops. I'm not going to read it, I mean, y'all can read. But I just want you to see that some of these people are very animate and very well versed in how they are expressing what they know. And one of the exciting things for me about this workshop was that I designed it so that it wasn't, the original design was that the participants would be all tribal environmental professionals. And I told the crew, I said, that's impossible, that's not going to happen. Not all tribes have tribal environmental professionals, and that's just not going to work. If you want to know what the people know, you invite the community. And so their response was, well, how do you invite the community? I go, well, you start with their leader. You know, you ask permission. You don't just, send an email or a phone call, because they're not, if they don't know you, we don't know what you know, we don't care what you know until we know that you care. Number one, you can have all the brains in the world, but if you're just self-purposing, we've got better things to do because we have to survive. So we invited this variety of community members, which were tribal environmental professionals, farmers, elders, and just concerned citizens from different tribes. Casey Camp-Hornick is one of my favorite people in the world. She's an actress, she's an activist, she's a clan leader, and her statements were some of the richest. Now, Estevaro Cruz, the first comment was from a tribal environmental professional, but there are 3 levels of respondents. There's the contemporaries that are very formally educated in the Western system, but not entirely connected to the cultural aspects of who they are or who their community is. Often those people were members of more assimilated tribes from relocation. Like in Oklahoma, we have that problem because it's just the way the government did it, and it works sometimes. And then we have people like Casey Camp-Hornick that are true traditionalists, never gave up, knows her language, knows who she is. And I have to say the traditionalists had the most defined explanations of what was happening. And then there were moderates that bridged both worlds. Some of the impacts that I found, all of them, every single one of them, somehow or another related to water. If water was the number one thing, and it was 3 levels of water, it wasn't just drinking water. It was water in the air, in the atmosphere, in the form of precipitation or lack thereof, or snow. And then it was surface water, lakes, streams, ponds, and a lot of that was either quality, quantity, accessibility, or disappearance. And then there was aquifer water, which really I hadn't anticipated that so much in my research, but aquifer water is one of the most alarming situations that people are dealing with, and especially tribes. There are wells in New Mexico that are thousands of years old that they're having to drill deeper for the first time since they were dug. And they're having to drill more wells. And then the quality of water is not always there, and nobody knows. There's not been a water study done on the aquifers in those regions to understand what's actually available. And then you have agriculture, the impacts of agriculture and the extractive industry, because Oklahoma is an oil and gas state, as well as Texas, which is in that region. Another big factor was weather. Weather is faster, is what my elder told me. The storms come quicker, they pass through faster, the water dumps quicker, it doesn't really soak into the soil, it runs off, it causes erosion, fills in our lakes, faster. The tornadoes are bigger, they come faster. That was a very powerful statement to me, to think about how in the South Central region, where it's the #1 area of climate denial, that these things are very powerful and they're happening, and nobody's ever really looked at it or talked about it. And so here I was, a native student from a tribal college, pointing all of these things out, and the scientists were a little uncomfortable. Also, some of the impacts that they discussed were wildlife and ecosystem shifts, where animals, plants were moving in and out of regions. The economy, people were struggling to afford to buy food during droughts and feed their animals, feed themselves, because the drought was so bad it evaporated water from the plants. It wasn't just the drought itself, it was the intensity of the heat. It got into 115, 120. It fried plants. Trees died, just transevaporation. Water pipes, water mains were breaking, roads were shifting and cracking, so the infrastructures that people depended on were significantly affected by these extreme droughts. Of course, cultural changes, they were moving ceremonies indoor because the elders couldn't handle the heat. And of course, the poor, the ill, and the elderly are the most at risk. So the next question was, are you talking about climate change? And there were multiple adaptations that some of the tribes and tribal individuals were implementing. Farming was one of the biggest ones, where they were farming smaller plots. They were going back to their traditional foods and getting rid of any of the modern corns and modern plants. They were going back to trying to preserve a lot of the food systems that their elders had depended on. I don't know if you can see it, but this is a hailstone that came through my house. It is an 8-inch hailstone, and there were hundreds of them in my yard after a tornado. So just want to point that picture out because it always cracks me up. There were some tribes. The droughts is the most common challenge that the people in the South Central region are experiencing. They're having haboobs, which are these giant dust storms that are in Arizona making sand dunes that never in the history of the Dene people do they have stories, artwork, songs that talk about sand dunes, and they're consuming communities. These haboobs in New Mexico are causing not only these wicked dust storms, but they're making the respiratory illnesses increase in the elderly and in the youth, and they are blowing away seeds off the surface during, it blows so hard that it literally blows the surface soil off of the seeds that they plant. So it's a big challenge. Some tribes are, like I said, very proactive. There are a few tribes that are looking at alternative energy projects, and there are a couple of tribes that are working with, like the landscape conservation cooperatives and the climate science centers, to do water studies. I found that most tribes were completely unprepared. The smaller the tribe, the more difficult it was for them. Most of them did not have environmental directors. They were, and those that did generally had 3 jobs. They weren't just the tribal environmental professional. They had like 4 jobs, 3 jobs, and they were stretched thin. And there was definitely no money to implement adaptation ideas. Some were struggling with day-to-day issues, and climate change just made a very difficult situation far worse. They were very reactionary. They could only handle what was in front of them at that moment. They weren't prepared to look past into the future, and they were concerned. Money and political will were also problems that were expressed. Planning was discussed a lot by participants in each of the workshops. There were many ideas offered on possible solutions, but only a small group were acting on those adaptations on a large scale. Like I said, most tribes are not prepared for worst-case scenarios of extreme weather and climate change. One of the things that was important that I thought that this quote emphasizes is to be educated enough to make your own decisions, and then take that understanding and incorporate your culture into that and make your own decisions that are appropriate for you, for us, for our tribes. And as a researcher, a settler society researcher that wants to be an ally, listen, be humble and realize that you don't know everything, because as the gentleman said earlier, you don't understand the knowledge-based relationship to place in the concentric relationship of the ontologies and epistemologies that you're dealing with when you come into an indigenous community that have never been relocated. One of the anomalies that came out of the project that really had not anticipated was the responsive responsibilities. There were personal responsibilities, communal responsibilities, and basically people talked about what they could do, what their communal responsibilities as far as educating their children, educate and passing down knowledge. There was the at-fault responsibility, who was at fault, which often was the gas and oil extractive industry. Over and over and over again, everybody discussed how water was being polluted, aquifers were being poisoned, fracking was destroying not only the region, but the water sources and air even. There were governmental responsibilities that they were supposed to be doing and not doing. There were multiple levels. There was also future responsibilities that people discussed about reduce, reuse, recycle, the whole mentality that, using less is more. Now, for the conclusion, like I said, all the respondents did understand and identify climate change and understood that there were impacts and responses varied by region and by scale, but they are not separated. I could not separate climate definitions and impacts from the way the tribal participants explained it to me. They were the same. And I found that interesting, that, like I said earlier, that climate change is a verb and an adjective. It's not a proper noun. It's an action, it's an experience. Water in all of its form is the biggest sector impacting everything in their lives, including ceremonies, plants and medicinal plants, food, animals are impacted negatively and struggling. Responses vary on financial ability. The government and extraction industry is responsible. And this is such a big project, there's so much more. There was a video, the interviews were videoed, they were put together in a 22-minute documentary style video. It's available here, it's free, you can use it, you can share it. It has interviews from multiple people, not all of them, although all of the people that participated in the project are recognized in the credits, and it is shared between all of us, and all of the participants vetted this before it was released, and they will all get copies of my thesis before it's completely approved. The IRB was sick on this project. It was so thick, it was like a book in itself. So I will keep this short because I know I'm cutting it close here, but Yahweh, thank you. And if you have questions at the end, I'd be more than happy to answer them.